Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here with the National History Academy. And today we are continuing our tour through different historic sites across the country. And we are joined today by Ranger Allison at Joshua Tree National Park. So Allison, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. It is so nice to be here. Welcome to my beautiful office. I'm just kidding. We'll go outside here in a second. It's a little windy, so I wanted to get some of the vibrations off the camera before we get outside. So I'm Ranger Allison. I'm the education specialist out here at Joshua Tree National Park. And we do tons of virtual field trips like this. So it's exciting to have everybody in our audience here today. Let's get you here first. Let's figure out where we are. So regardless of where you are in the country or across the globe, you want to get to Southern California. Once you are in Southern California, we are actually pretty close to Los Angeles. So, excuse me, Los Angeles, as the crow flies, is directly west of us. It's about a 2.5 hour drive-ish to get out here, but we're a pretty big park. I mean, you think about how big LA is, Los Angeles is, San Diego's down here, Mexico's kind of right at the end of this picture. We're 800,000 acres. We are the size of the state of Rhode Island. The part of the park that you are going to see today, though, is a very tiny corner. I'm way up here in the Blackrock Campground area. So I'm going to show you in a moment what this area looks like, but it actually can look a lot different from the rest of the park. We actually protect two deserts out here in Joshua Tree. The Mojave Desert, which is indicative with Joshua trees, and then the Colorado Desert, which is a lower elevation desert. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But you will see some Joshua trees. So let's go ahead and turn the camera around and give you a view of the Blackrock Campground here. So we are going to venture out into this desert here in a second. And I would put $20 on some of you not realizing the desert looked like this. I would bet you might be seeing some of the things you expected to see in a desert, but I would bet there's a lot more plants than what you might have thought would have existed in a desert. We do have some of those other characteristics like sand, there's a lot of rocks. But yeah, we have a lot of plants. So let me unhook my camera here and let's go venture out into the desert and take a look at some Joshua trees. So I'm going to cover up my camera here for a second so nobody gets nauseous from me moving things around. Okay. I am going to be moving my iPad. So if you get a little nauseous, you might want to just close your eyes for a minute, but I want to make sure everybody gets a good glance at the Mojave Desert here in Joshua Tree National Park. So we've got mountains, Joshua trees, lots of other stuff. It is springtime here in the desert. So we are seeing some colors. Here is one of our spring flowers, a mallow plant here. Very pretty orange plant. There's some tiny purples and lots of yellows this time of year. Although honestly, I don't see any yellows right in front of me. Our first stop is going to be at our Joshua tree though. Now, at first glance, this Joshua tree trunk probably does not look like what you would typically expect a tree trunk to look like. It's covered with dead, choky Joshua tree leaves that when they are alive, they're pointed up toward the sky. And when they die, they lay against the trunk. Now this serves two purposes. When we are in the desert, deserts are always dry. That is a statement we can definitively make. And so the plants and animals around here have specific adaptations that allow them to conserve the water in their bodies. So this, excuse me, this layer of dead leaves helps to protect the moisture inside the tree from evaporating when it's 110, 115 degrees here in the summertime. Now, I don't know if you caught that I mentioned earlier, maybe I didn't mention earlier, but Mojave Desert is a high elevation desert. That means we are up in the mountains. In fact, where I am right now is over 3,000 feet above sea level, which is pretty high. And when you get up into the mountains, you may not see a lot of water, but you do see snow. It does snow here. And so what this, excuse me, coating of leaves also does is to help keep the interior of the tree a little bit warmer than the exterior, so that when it snows, the water inside the tree doesn't freeze. Now, if anybody knows anything about water, water actually gets bigger when it freezes. Everything else gets smaller. And so when the water inside of living cells freezes, it can expand and kill that cell. When we see that in humans, we see that as frostbite, and in plants, it can kill the whole plant. So these trees, since they can't pick up their roots and walk to a better environment, they have to create their own adaptations. That's pretty cool. I mean, Josh, if we look off into the distance, you can see a lot of Joshua trees up here. If you happen to find yourself wandering the desert and had no idea where you were, if you saw a Joshua tree, you would know that you are in the Mojave Desert of the United States. Joshua trees only grow in the Mojave Desert, although there is something called divergent evolution, which means that similar habitats exist in other parts of the world with similar plants. And we often have people come and say, hey, I saw these plants in Israel. Well, you didn't, but you saw some plants that were really, really similar. And that is just because similar living things developing in similar habitats. So let's take a look and see if we can find any other signs of life. It's very common for plants out here to look dead until you zoom up on them. This is called a black bush. Actually, I guess it looks more gray from your perspective, but it looks dead most of the year. In the springtime, it develops these super teeny tiny leaves. So those tiny leaves are a way for this plant to conserve water. Broad leaves, so if you live in a place where the plants or the trees have broad leaves like the size of your hand, that allows for a lot of respiration, a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of water to move in and out of the plant. Small leaves don't allow for that. They allow for the conservation of water. So this plant is still getting food through photosynthesis that is happening in those leaves. It's just not losing a lot of moisture in the process. Oh, I think I see our first animal friend pop up here. How lucky are we? This is a bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep. This is a ram, which is the male version. We do have rams here, and disclaimer, this is not a real animal. If this was a real animal, we would want to be far enough away so that our thumb would cover up the animal. That's our quick safety test to determine how close we are to wildlife. But bighorn sheep do live out here in Joshua Tree. They love the rocks. They love the mountains. In fact, their feet have a soft part in their hooves that allows them to kind of curl around kind of the steepest inclines. So they can live in some pretty neat, pretty inhospitable looking, cliffs and such. Another neat thing about these animals is although they can be over 200 pounds, a lot of times they get the moisture that they need from the plants that they eat. So they don't necessarily need to have a watering hole because there are very few watering holes, natural springs and such out here in the desert. But that is one of our largest mammals. We also have some deer. We have mule deer and the occasional mountain lion, which will hunt animals like the bighorn sheep. That is one of my favorite animals. Right beside one of my favorite animals is one of my least favorite plants. But it's got a great bird. I'll tell you why this is my least favorite plant. So this here is called a Chia cactus. And Chia cactus, their spines have this Velcro-like structure on the end, these little hooks on the end. And so what happens when this plant is, if you walk past this plant, if you're an animal or if the wind, a tumbleweed catches it, little pieces of these spikes catch onto that tumbleweed or onto you, and they hold on to you. That's how this plant disperses its seeds. And it's really hard to get them off. I have a hairy dog and I have one of these in my neighbor's yards. So whatever ends up on my dog ends up on my carpet and then on my toe. That's 0% fun. However, we are starting to see some neat things happening here with this cactus. Those are two little flower blossoms. Maybe we'll see some cactus blossoms here in a minute. Now this bird, this cactus wren, has the fantastic ability to actually build its nest in the cholla cactus. That is a fantastic defense mechanism to help keep reptiles and other carnivorous birds from eating its eggs. Nothing's going to climb into this plant. Believe me, I'm not the only one who dislikes this plant here in the animal kingdom of the desert. So the cactus wren uses that to its advantage. Nest there. Let's take a look around. Oh, here's some pretty yellow flowers. So I did find some yellow. Let's see what else we can find. Here is a very common plant that we see out here in the desert. This is a creosote. And, you know, depending on where you are, different habitats will have different smells when it rains. The creosote gives a very distinctive scent to the desert during and after a rainfall. And that is because, let me see, I'm going to view here. These leaves, if you were able to see, they have a shiny coating on them. They have this kind of resiny, waxy coating on there. They're also small, like we saw with the blackbush. So that is one way to help preserve or conserve water. But that waxy coating also allows moisture to be preserved in this plant while still allowing sunshine through to allow photosynthesis to happen. So a big plant. In fact, there are creosotes that are thousands and thousands of years old out here. I believe the oldest creosote out here is something like 14,000 years old. Desert plants grow very slowly, and they are pretty amazing specimens of life. Oh, another cool specimen of life. One of my favorite birds happens to be right behind us. This is a Gambel's quail. So Gambel's quail are ground-dwelling birds. You'll often see them in the springtime. Soon, I will see them running around with their babies. They can lay between 10 and 15 eggs per clutch at a time. If it's a good rain year and a good food year, sometimes they'll even lay multiple clutches. Lots of babies running around. Those eggs are fantastic food sources for other ground-dwelling animals, reptiles, foxes, you know, other things that are going to eat eggs. But they have that nice short beak that is perfect for eating the seeds of the creosote or other plants that fruit and drop seeds onto the ground. I love seeing some quail. I also love seeing this bird. Another one of our desert friends here. This is a roadrunner. This is a carnivorous bird. So this is one of the birds that will actually go after the eggs, of the Gambel's quail. Another thing this roadrunner will eat is snakes. It will use a spiky beak to spear snakes and lizards and eat them. It is very fast. I think something like over 20 miles an hour this bird can run, and they're pretty big. They're actually, you know, maybe a little bit smaller than a chicken. They were surprisingly large when I first saw roadrunners out here years ago when I moved here. But they are some of the coolest birds to see out in the Mojave Desert. Now we saw one type of cactus. One thing I forgot to mention with the cholla is those spikes, as treacherous as they can be, those spikes are actually a type of modified leaf. It is a mechanism, it provides a defense mechanism, but if you notice back on that first cactus, it was a very light color. And those light colors help to reflect sunlight and help to prevent the plant from losing moisture, right? When it's hot, think about where you live. When it's hot, you certainly don't want to wear dark colors. You try to wear light colors. So here's another cactus here called the Mojave Mound. Again, no flowers, but we're seeing lots of buds on this cactus. But we're also seeing similar light colored spines. So again, this light color is helping to reflect sunlight, and each of those spines is actually casting shade onto this plant as well to help reduce the overall temperature around that plant. Now here is something exciting. How about that for a flowering cactus? This is a beaver tail cactus, and we are having a fantastic bloom season for the beaver tail. Now, looking at one of the cactus pads, you can see why it's called the beaver tail. You can see the shape. It's like a paddle. This thing is just loaded with buds. All those round things on the top are buds. But we're seeing some differences here, aren't we, between this type of cactus and the other ones? We aren't seeing any long spikes, right? Well, this doesn't have the long spikes like the other cactus, but it does still have spikes as a defense mechanism. And if I get a little bit closer, you can hopefully see little fuzzy patches on and all those little dots. Those little dots are full of little clusters of spikes called glochids. So even though these spikes aren't going to overtly, scare you if you were an animal trying to eat this, on some cactus they're called like cow blinders or cattle blinders, something like that, because they will stick in your skin or stick on your face, and you can't pull them out very easily. So they still serve as a defense mechanism. They are, those little dots are actually creating shade. The shape of the cactus itself is giving shade on one side of the plant and staying sunny on the other side. So again, we have different adaptations to help preserve some moisture. And these flowers are just the most beautiful color ever. You can see some pollinators in there collecting nectar, hoping to spread that pollen from one beaver tail cactus to another for the next season. I am loving seeing these cactus around this year. Let's go ahead and make our way down the hill. Here's another cholla. They can get to be pretty tall. This one is probably 5 feet, over 5 feet tall. In fact, here's my favorite kind of cholla though. A dead cholla. This is kind of cool if you've never seen the interior of a cactus before. Cholla cactus, similar to saguaro, those really tall cactus that we tend to think of when we think of desert cactus, although we don't have those cactus here. They have these woody structures inside of their, mushy green stuff, the plant material. And so that woody structure provides stability for the plant, but it's hollow. See how hollow that is? It's pretty neat. And you can still see some of the old cactus spines stuck onto this. So when the plant dies, the mushy stuff all decays away, and what's left is this woody structure. It's pretty neat. And right behind it is a close cousin of the Joshua tree, the Yucca plant. This yucca is blooming. In fact, most of our Joshua trees have bloomed already and are now fruiting. This plant is really important as a cultural plant. All of this plant were useful. So, we like to give thanks to the native people who have been here since time immemorial. We've had the Mojave, the Serrano, the Chemehuevi, and the Cahuilla continue to exist in the Mojave Desert and serve as excellent stewards of the land. And they have history with this plant. The flowers could be eaten, the fruits could be eaten. You can see little, hopefully you can see little strings hanging off of this plant. Those strings can be pulled off carefully and woven into the bottoms of shoes or baskets, netting, all kinds of things. And even the root of this plant down underground could be dug out, mushed, and boiled into a soapy substance. So this entire plant was useful historically with desert tribes. Now I see another one of our more famous animals down here. Oh, there's a lizard. That's not the one I was hoping to point out, but that was a nice little visitor there. This guy right here. So this is a tortoise. This is an empty tortoise shell, actually. And, you see this weird lump on this tortoise here. So the desert is it's not listed as an endangered species, but it is protected under the Endangered Species Act as threatened, which is one step below endangered. So scientists are working on getting this animal listed as endangered because we see its numbers dramatically decreasing. People are moving out to the desert in droves. And then there's solar farms. There's a lot of development happening in the desert that is eliminating habitat from or for the desert tortoise. Now, Joshua Tree National Park, as most national parks, they're great laboratories. They're great places to study nature without the influence of human activity. And so here in the park, we have about 15 desert tortoises that have these radio transmitters on them. This gives off a signal that can be retrieved through this kind of like antenna system we can go out in the field with. And then when we find one of these 14 animals, we look for them monthly. So we do look for them multiple times a year. When we find one of these animals, we weigh them, we measure them, we see, make note of where they are. Are they hanging out with another tortoise? Oftentimes they are. Do they have babies? Do they have a nest? Or are they dead? Obviously, this one was found dead, pretty well decayed when we found this one. So, we take a lot of measurements because the idea is that we collect this data so that once the animal becomes listed as endangered, we can now use that data toward breeding and reintroducing the animal to its native habitat. So tortoises are really special to us out here in the Mojave Desert. But right next to the tortoise, we see some signs. Now, coming out to the desert, you are most likely not going to see any life. Humans like to be out during the hottest times of the day, and animals aren't that stupid, right? They like to be under the shade somewhere. So oftentimes, if you go to a national park, you may only see signs of wildlife. This is poop. And we know this is poop from a wild animal because there are all kinds of bones in here. Wild animals eat other animals. And luckily, this animal happens to be hanging out for us to say hi. This is a coyote. Coyotes are they're everywhere, right? You probably live in a place that has coyotes. And if you don't know you have coyotes, maybe you've heard them at night. They're out right now making a lot of noise here because, again, it's springtime. They're having pups. They're looking for food. Their pups are learning how to socialize. It's a very adaptable animal. They do live in dens, but they make their own winter coat, right? They have a winter jacket, the fur that forms in the fall, and then they shed that fur for springtime. So this is another really cool animal to see. You're not necessarily always going to see one, but here we often hear them at night. I hear them a lot from my house at nighttime. The last thing I want to show you, this is another culturally significant plant that I doubt many of you have seen in the wild. And then we'll do questions after this. This is what chia looks like in the wild. So this purple plant here will develop chia seeds. It is a member of the mint family, so it has an odor. It also has a square stem. That's how you can tell members of the mint family. But chia seed historically has been collected by Native Americans in the area as a food source. We eat it now as a food source as well. It's a great source of protein and fiber. And has a really strong scent to it. So you always know when chia is around. All right, so I am going to retreat back to the interior here so that I'm out of the wind. And I would love to take our time to answer questions from folks.
Yeah, Allison, that was great and wonderful to see. It was so cool seeing that all live. We're going to be joined now by our intern, Ben Kellerholz, who's going to read some of the audience questions for us.
Yeah, hey there, Allison. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm coming at you from Arizona, so I know a little bit. It's a little similar terrain, coyotes and whatnot.
Yep.
Yeah, out here as well, people got to be careful for their cats and dogs with some of that stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get to it. Our first question is, with such a large park, how many rangers work on site, and how many people does it take to maintain such a large area?
Well, the bad news is not enough. It's never enough. We have the ranger force is a mix of people. There's a lot of us that wear the same uniform, the green pants and the gray shirt, and the public tends to think of all of us as rangers. So if you look at all of the staff that's out doing different positions within the park, there's about 100 of us year round, and maybe another 50 that come on during our high visitation season, which is in the winter time. But the typical park ranger, like the ones that are making sure, that carry the guns, that are law enforcement officers, we have like 5 of them. And then the rangers that do the things that I do, that do public programs, there's probably 20 of us, but a lot of us are in visitor centers giving orientation information. So, with the 800,000 acres in the state of, Rhode Island that we are basically sworn to protect as part of our job, there's a lot of it we just don't get to.
Yeah. Let's see. How did this area in particular become part of the National Park Service?
Well, every national park has a champion, right? A national park, we go back to the beginning of the Park Service and the creation of Yellowstone. The name eludes me of who started the process of protecting that, but one of the main reasons why Yellowstone was set aside for protection, there were 2 reasons. One, there was people were going there and breaking off parts of the hot springs, but also it was the last wild herd of bison, of buffalo in the country. So although there were bison, on large ranches in Texas, this is the last wild herd. So there was a movement to protect that area, protect the habitat for the bison. And then national parks, the big ones, you have proponents, you have people who are interested in that area. For us, it was a woman named Minerva Hoyt. She came out here after World War I with her husband, who was suffering from lung ailments from the war. A lot of veterans are being told to head west to cleaner air. She got out here and found, and her husband died. And then shortly after, her newborn son died as well. And she found solace in the desert. She loved the cactus, the plants. It was her own, that was where she communed with her family that had left her. So she became the initial proponent for what was originally going to be Desert Plants National Park, which is not a very, it's not a very sexy name, right? So as she took her mission to Washington, D.C., what ended up as a much smaller chunk of land that became Joshua Tree National Park, or Joshua Tree National Monument, actually. So presidents can declare national monuments just by signing it. National parks have to be congressionally created. So we became a national park in 1994 when Congress signed the Desert Protection Act, but we started off as a national monument, as lots of national parks actually do.
Great, yeah, that's a pretty unique history. Let's see, you might have mentioned something along these lines, but how many different types of wildlife would you say are in the park?
An amazing array, right? There's a fair amount of permanent, mammals here, the Bighorn Sheep, the bobcats, the things that the mountain lions, the deer. We have a permanent population of those. We have, smaller mammals, rabbits, foxes, rodents, that kind of stuff. We've got a fair amount of lizards and reptiles, snakes, the desert tortoise. We don't have huge lizards. Our biggest lizard is the Chuckwalla. And Chuckwallas only get to be about, if you measure your arm from like your elbow to your fingertips, that's about as long as a Chuckwalla from tip to tail. So they're not super big. We don't have like Gila monsters and that kind of stuff out here. There's a lot of birds that migrate through. We're not far from the Salton Sea, so we're right on that migratory path for a lot of birds heading from, the North Pacific kind of side of the country. So we have an amazing array of birds that come through, but there's a lot of life out here.
And I'm sure that's what makes it so interesting for everyone. As you mentioned, even if the original name was supposed to be indicative of that
Desert
specifically.
plants.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, I think for the last question we'd like to ask you as our great guide today, maybe how you got to where you are working at this site, and if you had any advice for people that might want to do a similar thing.
Sure. So I went to college to be a geologist. I was a geology major. I will flat out say that there are lots of rangers I have worked with who did not do four-year college. So there's multiple ways to get into the National Park Service with all of the different types of jobs. You know, there's trades, there's craftsmen, there's you know, the stuff that I do, the education things, there's all kinds of different types of jobs to get involved with. But mine did involve four-year college for science. I was a science teacher, but I always, you know, I never got rid of that kind of wanderlust to see the geology in person that I saw in my textbooks. And I'm from the East Coast, and everything on the East Coast is covered with plants. So I just wanted to move somewhere with rocks. So my Park Service journey started as a volunteer at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And I worked at Badlands, I worked at Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, and the Dakotas are full of undiscovered gems. They're amazing places. Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I think those were all of my seasonal jobs, but I ended up getting a permanent job at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. So I worked at Minuteman Missile. I worked at a former nuclear missile site as well, which is pretty wild. But then I moved here about 6 years ago to manage the education program, because education was always, you know, I always wanted to work with kids, with students. That audience is far more exciting for me to work with than an audience of adults. So now I get to do that every day. I get to lead field trips. I get to do programs like this. It's the stuff that I saw myself doing back in school.
That's wonderful. Allison, thank you so much for sharing and being with us today. We truly appreciate it. And that was a really great insight to the park and really lovely to see.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining in. We'll be back here next week, same time, and hope to see you there. Have a wonderful rest of your day.